The land around Grant Callahan's cabin didn't forgive. It was a hard-bitten stretch of Arizona territory where the sun baked the earth into a cracked, red canvas and the wind scoured the rock until it bled dust. Saguaro cacti stood like silent, wounded sentinels, their arms raised to a sky that was either a blinding, indifferent blue or a bruised purple before a storm. This was a place for men who had nothing left to say to the world, and the world, in turn, had stopped speaking to them. Grant fit right in. He was a man carved from the same stubborn material as the landscape. His face was a roadmap of long days under that sun, with the lines etched deep around his eyes from squinting at the horizon. But the map that truly defined him wasn't on his face. It started at the base of his neck, a pale, ropey line of puckered flesh that disappeared beneath the collar of his worn chambray shirt. It snaked down over his collarbone, across his chest, and followed the curve of his ribs, ending somewhere near his hip. A Confederate bayonet had drawn that line years ago, in a place that smelled of wet earth and gunpowder, a place he tried to forget every time he woke up. He had left Virginia, but the war had followed him west, clinging to him like the fine red dust that settled on everything he owned. His cabin was small, built of pine logs he'd felled and stripped himself. It stood alone in the shadow of a high mesa, the only sign of human life for miles. Smoke would curl from its stone chimney in the cool of the morning and the fading light of evening, a lonely signal to no one in particular. The inside was sparse, holding only what a man needed to keep breathing: a narrow cot, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, a stone hearth for cooking and warmth, and a few cast-iron pots hanging from hooks. On a small shelf sat a tin of coffee, a sack of flour, and a worn Bible he never opened but couldn't bring himself to throw away. It had been his mother's. The most peculiar thing about the cabin was its door. It was a solid plank of wood, and it was never locked. It wasn't even barred, not from a place of trust in his fellow man. The war had burned that notion out of him completely. It was simpler than that. Grant Callahan had nothing left for anyone to take. A thief could steal his skillet, his last half-pound of salted pork, even the threadbare blanket on his cot. It wouldn't matter. The things that haunted him, the real weight he carried, couldn't be lifted by another man's hands. Leaving the door unlocked was a quiet act of defiance, a silent statement to the vast, empty land. I have nothing left to fear because I have nothing left to lose. His days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun. He'd rise before dawn, when the air still held a hint of the night's chill. He'd build a small fire, boil coffee, and eat a piece of hardtack or a biscuit left over from the night before. He'd spend the day mending the short stretch of fence for his aging horse, Jericho, or clearing stubborn rocks from a small patch of earth where he tried to grow corn, or simply sitting on his porch, watching the shadows of the clouds drift across the valley floor. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, the quiet economy of a man who knows his only company is time. Sometimes, when he reached to lift a heavy log or saddle Jericho, the scar would pull tight against his skin, a sharp, familiar sting. It was a reminder, a physical anchor to the man he used to be, the boy who had marched off full of fire and come back hollowed out, carrying ghosts. This night, the wind came down from the north, a low, mournful howl that swept through the canyon. It sounded like a hungry animal, clawing at the corners of the cabin, rattling the leather hinges of the door, and forcing fine grit through the chinks in the logs. Grant sat at his table, the flame of a single tallow lamp flickering, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He was cleaning his rifle, a habit from the war he'd never shaken. The methodical slide and click of the metal parts was a familiar comfort in the growing symphony of the storm. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never was. A sound, almost lost in a gust of wind, made him pause. It wasn't the scrape of a branch or the skittering of a rock. It was a soft, hesitant tapping on the door. He froze, his hands still on the rifle stock. No one came to his door. Prospectors and traders used the main trail 5 miles to the south. The local Apache kept to their own lands. The only people who ventured this far out were either hopelessly lost or running from something. He set the rifle down quietly and walked to the door. The wind tore at it as he pulled it open, the lamp flame guttering wildly behind him. And there she was. She looked like a thing the storm itself had spit out. A young woman, though it was hard to tell her age. Her hair, a dark tangle of wet strands, was plastered to her face. Her dress, a simple calico, was torn at the shoulder and hemmed with mud. Her feet were bare, caked with red dirt and scratched. But it was her eyes that held him. They were wide and red-rimmed, not just from the wind, but from a depth of crying that had scraped her raw from the inside out. He saw a flicker of panic in them, the look of a cornered animal, before it was replaced by a sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. Her wrists were raw and chafed, red lines stark against her pale skin, as if she'd fought against a rope or a rough grip. She didn't speak. She just stood there, swaying slightly on her feet, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold the last pieces of her being together. Grant felt the old, familiar weight settle in his chest. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who had seen too much, in the faces of women left behind in burned-out towns. It was the look of someone who had run until they couldn't run another step, someone whose world had been ripped out from under them. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from or what she was running from. Questions were a luxury, a currency he no longer traded in. Words would only force her to relive whatever horror had sent her out into the storm. And he, of all people, knew that some stories were better left untold, locked away behind the teeth. So he did the only thing that made sense. He stepped back from the doorway, pulling the door open wider. It was an invitation without words, an offer of sanctuary in the middle of nowhere. He didn't smile or make any gesture of comfort. He just held the space open for her. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her eyes darted from his face to the warm, flickering light inside the cabin, then back. He saw the calculation, the fear warring with the desperate need for shelter. He remained still, a silent, weathered statue in the doorway, letting her make the choice. Finally, with a shuddering breath that seemed to cost her everything, she took a hesitant step forward, then another, crossing the threshold from the howling chaos of the night into the quiet solitude of his home. She moved past him, her head bowed, and stopped near the hearth, drawn to its lingering warmth. She was trembling, either from cold or from fear, or both. Grant closed the door, the solid thud shutting out the scream of the wind. The sudden silence in the cabin was immense, broken only by the crackle of the embers in the fireplace and the sound of the girl's ragged breathing. He didn't look at her directly. Instead, he walked over to his cot and pulled off the second of his 2 wool blankets. It was coarse and smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. He folded it once and then walked over to the side of the hearth, a few feet from where she stood, shivering. He laid the blanket down on the hard-packed earth floor. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest. It was dry. It was warm. It was safe. He didn't say, "You can sleep here." He didn't say anything at all. He just placed the blanket down. A simple, final gesture. Then he turned his back to her, walked back to his chair, and picked up his rifle again, resuming his task of cleaning it as if nothing had happened. He was giving her space, giving her the dignity of not being watched in her misery. He could feel her presence behind him, a small, fragile thing in the vast emptiness of his life. He heard a soft rustling, then the sound of her sinking down onto the blanket. The fire popped, sending a spark up the chimney. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song. Inside, 2 strangers, adrift in their own silent storms, shared a roof, their unspoken histories filling the space between them. For the first time in a long time, the unlocked door had let something in. Grant Callahan wasn't sure if it was a blessing or a curse. He just knew it was there. The girl he didn't know her name, and didn't ask slept the way the dead might sleep if they were granted one final rest. It was a profound, bottomless slumber, a total surrender of a body and mind pushed far beyond their limits. For nearly 2 full cycles of the sun, she barely moved from the wool blanket by the hearth. The storm passed, and the silence that returned to the canyon was deeper than before, now filled with the soft, steady sound of her breathing. Grant moved about his days with a new, quiet purpose. He still rose before dawn, still boiled his coffee, still went out to tend to Jericho and his small, stubborn plot of land. But now, his movements were softer, his steps lighter on the cabin's floorboards. He'd catch himself before letting the cabin door slam shut in the breeze. When he chopped wood, he did it further from the cabin than usual, the rhythmic thud of his axe muffled by distance. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and her presence was like a new landmark in a familiar landscape, something to be navigated with caution. He never approached her. He'd leave a tin plate with a piece of cornbread and a strip of jerky on the floor near her head, along with a cup of water. Before he left for the day, when he returned, the food would be gone, the cup empty. It was their only communication. He watched her sometimes, not with curiosity, but with a kind of weary recognition. He saw the way her fingers would clench in her sleep, the occasional twitch of a nightmare chasing her through the darkness. He knew what it was to be hunted by your own mind, to find no peace even in unconsciousness. The ghosts of Shiloh and Antietam walked with him still. He supposed she had ghosts of her own. It was on the afternoon of the second day that she woke. The sun was slanting low through the single window, casting a warm, golden rectangle of light across the floor. Grant was sitting at his table, mending a piece of leather harness, his hands moving with slow, practiced skill. A log shifted in the hearth, sending a cascade of bright orange sparks up the chimney with a sharp crackle. The sound tore her from her sleep. One moment she was a still form under a blanket. The next she was scrambling backward, a choked, terrified sound catching in her throat. Her eyes were wide, unseeing at first, filled with a raw, animal panic. She crab-walked away from the blanket until her back hit the cold, hard stones of the fireplace. And there she coiled into herself, a tight ball of fear. She tucked her head down, wrapping her arms around her knees as if to make herself disappear. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She was no longer in his cabin. She was somewhere else, somewhere terrible, reliving the moment that had sent her fleeing into the wilderness. Grant remained perfectly still in his chair. He set the piece of harness down on the table, his movements slow and deliberate. He had seen men break like this. He had seen the 1,000-yard stare, the sudden flinching at a loud noise. He knew that any sudden movement, any attempt at a comforting word, would be like throwing fuel on a fire. He had to be a rock, a part of the landscape, something that posed no threat. He waited. He counted his own steady heartbeats, a silent metronome in the tense quiet of the room. He waited for her panicked breathing to slow, for her eyes to begin to focus, to see not the ghosts of her past, but the simple reality of the log walls, the hearth, and the silent man sitting at the table. Slowly, the terror receded from her gaze, replaced by a wary confusion. Her eyes darted around the small cabin, taking it in for what felt like the first time. They landed on him, and he saw the fear spark again. But this time it was different. It was the fear of the unknown, not the certainty of a threat. Grant did not speak. He rose from his chair with a quiet deliberation that was almost painful to watch. He did not look at her. He turned to the iron pot that hung over the warm embers, where a thin rabbit stew had been simmering for hours. He picked up a wooden bowl and a ladle. The smell of wild herbs and savory broth filled the small space. He ladled the soup into the bowl, the liquid steaming in the cool air. He approached her as a man might approach a spooked mare. He didn't walk directly at her, but took a curved path, keeping his body angled away. He stopped several feet from her, bent down, and placed the bowl of soup on the floor between them. It was an offering, a truce. Then he performed the most profound act of kindness he was capable of. He turned his back on her. He walked to the cabin door, opened it, and leaned against the frame, looking out at the fading light as the sun bled its colors across the western mesa. He was giving her the gift of his absence, freeing her from the obligation of thanks, from the pressure of his gaze. He was letting her be. Behind him, the silence stretched. He heard the faint scrape of the bowl on the packed earth floor. He heard the soft, hesitant sound of sipping. He didn't turn around. He stayed at his post, a silent guardian at the edge of her world, until he heard the bowl being gently set back down. Life in the cabin settled into a new, unspoken rhythm. They were two shadows sharing a single small space. They moved around each other with a quiet, careful choreography, never speaking, rarely making eye contact. The girl he eventually learned her name was June, not because she told him, but because she whispered it once in a nightmare. A single, sharp syllable of distress began to emerge from her cocoon of fear. She remained wary, but her eyes, which had been wide with terror, were now filled with a quiet, intense observation. She watched him. She learned the man through his habits, through the things he did when he thought no one was paying attention. She noticed his hands. They were strong, calloused hands, capable of felling a tree or setting a delicate snare. But she saw the tremor. It happened when he was tired, or when he lifted something heavy. One morning, he was driving a new post for the fence line. He raised the heavy sledgehammer over his head, his muscles taut, for a brief second. As the hammer reached its apex, his right hand trembled, a fine, uncontrollable vibration that shook the handle. He brought the hammer down, the impact a solid, satisfying thud, but he paused before lifting it again. He lowered it to the ground, and she saw him stare at his hand, flexing his fingers as if commanding them to obey. He thought he was alone. He didn't know a pair of watchful eyes saw the flicker of frustration and weariness that crossed his face before he masked it again, his expression becoming as impassive as the rock of the mesa behind him. She also learned how he used the light. The cabin was a dark place, illuminated only by the door, a single small window, and the fire. She began to notice that Grant always positioned himself in the shadows. When he sat at the table, his back was to the window. When he stood in the doorway, he stood just inside, letting the bright, harsh sunlight frame him, leaving his face unreadable. He turned his back to the light as if it were an accuser. It was a way of being present without being seen, a way of hiding in plain sight. He was a man who had been exposed to the absolute worst of the world, and now he seemed determined to let as little of it as possible see him in return. They lived together, but they lived alone. June began to take on small tasks. She'd sweep the floor with a broom she fashioned from a branch and dried grasses. When he returned from checking his traps, she would already have water drawn from the small creek a quarter-mile away. She'd mend his shirts with a needle and thread she found in a small wooden box, her stitches small and neat. He would acknowledge her work with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He never said thank you, but one evening, he left a portion of the stew for her that had twice as much meat. The next morning, she left an extra piece of cornbread on his plate. They communicated in a language of silent deeds, of gestures that spoke of a shared, unspoken understanding of survival. They were not friends, not family. They were two wounded animals who had found the same cave to wait out a storm, one that raged outside for her and one that had been raging inside him for years. Their scars were not all on the skin, and in the quiet, dusty cabin, they gave each other the space to bleed without judgment, to heal without the burden of words. They were two ghosts, learning the shape of each other's silence. The weeks bled into a month, and the raw edges of June's terror began to soften, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of life in the canyon. A fragile sense of normalcy had taken root in the dust. The mornings were their own silent ritual. Grant would be gone when she woke, the cabin already filled with the smell of coffee he'd left warming by the hearth. She would drink it, eat a piece of cornbread, and then begin her own small duties. She'd sweep the packed earth floor, draw water, and sometimes walk the perimeter of the cabin, gathering dried brush for the fire. He had given her a purpose, not with words, but by creating a space for her to make one for herself. And in doing so, he had given her a foothold in a world that had tried to cast her out. One morning, the light was different. A thin layer of clouds had muted the sun's usual ferocity, bathing the canyon in a soft, gray glow. The air was still and cool. June pushed open the heavy plank door to step outside and felt the change immediately. It was a day for listening, a day where sound traveled far. She could hear the distant cry of a hawk and the gentle nicker of Jericho in his small corral. She took a breath, the clean, sage-scented air a balm. Then she looked down. On the top step, just over the threshold, were 3 distinct drops of blood. They were dark crimson, almost black, stark against the weathered gray of the wood. A cold fist clenched in her stomach. It was a primal, visceral reaction. Blood was a language she understood too well. It was the ink in which the worst chapters of her life had been written. For a moment, she was back in the storm, the taste of fear coppery in her mouth. Her eyes darted wildly toward the horizon, searching for a threat, for the source. But the canyon was still. The only movement was a lizard skittering across a rock. Her gaze followed the ground. Another drop, smaller this time, lay in the dust a few feet away. And then another, leading a faint, sporadic trail toward the woodpile at the side of the cabin. He was there. His back was to her, as it so often was. He was splitting logs, his broad shoulders moving with a familiar, powerful rhythm. He'd raise the heavy axe, pause for a beat at the top of the arc, and bring it down with a clean, sharp crack that echoed off the rock face. He was working at a steady, relentless pace, as if trying to outrun something, to beat it into submission with sheer physical effort. June approached slowly, her bare feet making no sound in the soft dirt. As she drew closer, she saw it. The left sleeve of his shirt, just below the elbow, was soaked through with a dark, wet stain. With each swing of the axe, a fresh, tiny droplet would fly from the fabric, staining the wood chips at his feet. He was bleeding, and he was acting as if it wasn't happening, ignoring it with a kind of grim determination that was more alarming than any cry of pain would have been. She stopped a few feet behind him. She didn't say his name. She didn't speak at all. She just stood there, her presence a silent question mark in the cool morning air. For a long moment, he didn't acknowledge her. He finished his swing, splitting a thick pine round neatly in 2. He let the axe head rest on the chopping block and finally, slowly, turned his head just enough to see her out of the corner of his eye. He didn't look surprised. His expression was one of deep, weary annoyance. It wasn't directed at her. It was the look of a man betrayed by his own body, a man who considered any physical weakness a personal failing. He saw her gaze fall to his arm, and his jaw tightened. He gave a slight, dismissive shake of his head, a gesture that said, "It's nothing. Go away." June did not go away. She held his gaze for a second longer, her own expression quiet but unyielding. Then she turned and walked back into the cabin. He watched her go, a flicker of something, maybe relief, maybe disappointment in his eyes. He probably thought she had accepted his silent dismissal. He was wrong. She returned a minute later. In her hands, she carried the small wooden box where she had found the needle and thread. She also had a strip of clean cloth torn from a worn-out shirt, a tin cup of water, and the bottle of whiskey he kept on the high shelf. She walked back to the woodpile and set the items down carefully on a large, flat stump. She didn't look at him. She just laid out her tools, her movements precise and deliberate. It was a statement. This was happening. Grant watched her. His one visible eye narrowed. He stood motionless, the axe handle still clutched in his right hand. A long, silent battle of wills passed between them. He was a man who had never accepted help, who bore his pain like a shield. She was a girl who had been given nothing but harm, and was now, for the first time, choosing to offer care. With a ragged sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a dozen battles, he relented. He leaned the axe against the chopping block and slowly, stiffly, sat down on the edge of the stump she had just cleared. He didn't look at her as he began to unbutton the cuff of his bloody sleeve and push the wet fabric up his forearm. The wound was ugly. It was a deep, ragged gash about 3 inches long, oozing sluggishly. It looked like a slip of the axe, a moment of carelessness. But what made it worse was where it was. The new cut ran right alongside a thick, ancient scar, a livid, puckered trail of flesh that was a different color from the rest of his sun-darkened skin. An old bullet wound, perhaps, or a piece of shrapnel. The fresh injury had split the dead, unyielding scar tissue, making the wound deeper and more stubborn than it should have been. June knelt in the dirt in front of him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. This was closer than she had ever been to him. She could smell the scent of pine and sweat and the metallic tang of his blood. She reached out a hesitant hand, then pulled it back. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and then reached out again. Her fingers, small and trembling, made contact with his arm. It was the first time she had ever touched him. His skin was hot with exertion, the muscles in his forearm hard as oak beneath her fingertips. He flinched, an involuntary tightening of the muscle, but he didn't pull away. She gently took his arm in her hand to hold it steady. As she began to clean the wound with a rag dipped in water, her thumb brushed against the old scar. It was a shock. The surrounding skin was warm and alive, but the scar itself was cold. It felt dead, a hard, smooth ridge like a length of steel wire buried just beneath the surface. It was a patch of his past, preserved and lifeless, on his living body. It felt ancient and full of a cold, silent violence. In that moment, she understood that he was a man made of old wounds, and this new one was just a postscript on a story of pain written long ago. She worked in silence, her movements becoming more confident as she focused on the task. She poured a little of the whiskey over the gash. Grant's entire body went rigid, and a sharp hiss of breath escaped through his clenched teeth, but he made no other sound. He stared fixedly at the distant mesa, his face a mask of stone. He was turning away from her, from the intimacy of the moment, from the vulnerability of being tended to. But he didn't pull his arm back. She threaded the needle. Her hands, which had been trembling, were now steady. She took another breath and pushed the needle through his skin. He didn't move. He just sat there, a statue of endurance, letting her perform this small, painful act of repair. She worked meticulously, pulling the edges of the wound together, her stitches small and even. It felt like she was mending more than just skin. With each pass of the needle, she was stitching together the silent, fractured space between them, creating a connection forged not of words, but of whiskey and thread, and a shared, profound understanding of what it meant to be hurt. When she was finished, she tied off the thread, snipped it with her teeth, and gently wrapped the clean cloth around his forearm, fashioning a tight, neat bandage. Her work was done. She stayed kneeling for a second longer, her hands resting lightly on his bandaged arm. Then, she slowly let go and drew back. She gathered her things, the needle, the cup, the bottle, and stood up. Grant still hadn't looked at her. He sat for a moment more, staring at nothing, before slowly pulling his sleeve down over the fresh bandage. He stood, picked up his axe, and without a glance in her direction, walked away toward the corral to check on his horse. The confrontation was over. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was heavier, fuller. It was no longer the silence of two strangers sharing a roof. It was the silence of two people who had crossed a boundary, who had touched, for the briefest of moments, the cold, hard reality of each other's scars. The act of stitching Grant's arm had changed the silence, Before, it had been a buffer, a wide, empty space they each kept between themselves and the world. Now, it was a shared territory. It was still quiet in the small cabin, the days still measured by the rising and setting of the sun, but an invisible thread now connected them, a line of inquiry and acknowledgement that had been stitched into place along with his skin. He never mentioned the wound, and she never asked about it, but in the mornings, she would see him flexing his hand, testing the pull of the stitches, his movements less guarded than before, and when he passed her the water bucket or the coffee pot, his gaze would linger for a second longer, not quite meeting hers, but resting on her hands, the hands that had tended to him. A silent, grudging respect had been born in that moment of shared pain. Life took on a pattern that felt less like two people coexisting and more like a single, quiet organism. He began leaving a small stack of kindling inside the door each evening. Saving her the task of gathering it, she, in turn, started baking an extra cornbread in the morning, wrapping it in a cloth and leaving it on the table for him to take when he went out. They were small, unspoken kindnesses, a currency of care that required no words. She learned the sound of his footsteps, the heavy, even tread that announced his return at dusk. He learned the soft, humming sound she sometimes made when she was mending his clothes, a sound so low it was almost part of the wind. The heat of summer had settled deep into the bones of the canyon. The days were long and blindingly bright, forcing life into the shadows. The nights, however, were a mercy. Once the sun dropped behind the high mesa, the baked earth would begin to release its heat, and a cool breeze would whisper down from the rocks, carrying the scent of dust and dry sage. It was on one of these nights that Grant built a small fire outside. He often did this, preferring the vast, open ceiling of the stars to the close confines of the cabin. He would sit on an old log, nursing a cup of coffee, staring into the flames as if searching for an answer in their dance. Usually, June would remain inside, a silent presence behind the single window. But tonight, after the fire was steadily burning, she pushed open the door and stepped out. She held a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Though the air was not cold, it was a shield, a small piece of the cabin's safety she brought with her into the open. Grant saw her but said nothing. He didn't acknowledge her with a nod or a gesture. He simply shifted his weight on the log, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that made a little more room, an invitation that was not an order. She accepted it, moving with a quiet grace to sit on the far end of the log. The fire crackled and spat between them, a small, bright world in a universe of darkness. For a long time, they just sat, watching the flames devour the dry juniper wood. The smoke rose in a straight, thin column into the star-dusted sky. The silence was comfortable, a well-worn coat they now shared. Then, from far up the canyon, a sound drifted down to them. It was a long, mournful cry, rising in pitch before falling away into a series of sharp yaps, a lone coyote, calling to a world that rarely answered. A moment later, from another direction, an answer came, a chorus of howls that echoed off the rock walls, a wild and lonely symphony. June flinched, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. It wasn't a sound of immediate danger. Grant's posture hadn't changed. His body remained relaxed, but it was a sound of profound isolation. It was the sound of the wilderness, a reminder of how small and fragile they were. Two people huddled around a tiny spark of light in an immense and indifferent darkness. Grant glanced at her, noticing the tension in her shoulders. He said nothing, just tossed a fresh branch onto the fire. The new wood hissed, and a shower of orange sparks flew up into the night. The howling faded, and the silence that rushed back in to fill the void was deeper, more contemplative. It was June who broke it. Her voice, when it came, was so soft it was almost carried away by the breeze. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the heart of the fire, on the glowing, crumbling embers. "I ran away from home," she said. The words came out on a single, quiet breath, as if they had been sitting on her tongue for weeks, waiting for the right moment to escape. Grant remained still, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't turn to her. He didn't ask why. He just listened, giving her the space to continue. Or not. She took a shaky breath. "He wasn't my father, not my real one." She paused, and the fire popped, as if punctuating her thought. "He was just the man my mother chose, so we could survive." The simple, unadorned statement hung in the air between them, heavy with everything it did not say. It spoke of a home that was not a sanctuary, of a childhood that was not a childhood. It spoke of desperation, of hard choices, and of a kind of survival that cost a piece of your soul. She offered no more details. None were needed. The raw, chafed skin of her wrists when she'd arrived had already told part of that story. Her words filled in the rest. Grant did not offer sympathy. He knew, better than most, how useless words like "I'm sorry" could be. They were smooth, polished stones offered to someone drowning, when what they needed was a solid piece of wood to cling to. Instead, he stared into the fire, letting her confession settle. He let it become a part of their shared silence, a truth that now belonged to the space around the fire as much as it belonged to her. After a long while, when the logs had burned down to a glowing, pulsating bed of coals, he spoke. His own voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel. "I came home from Virginia," he said, his gaze distant, looking at something far beyond the fire, beyond the canyon, back east across a decade of time. "But I never really came back." It was his own confession, offered in exchange for hers, a piece of his brokenness to lay beside hers. It was a short, simple sentence, but it explained everything. It explained the unlocked door, the tremor in his hands, the way he turned his back to the light, the man who had left for the war. The boy named Grant Callahan had died somewhere in the mud and cannon smoke. The thing that had returned to wear his name and inhabit his body was just a shell. A ghost haunted by the boy he'd been and the men he'd killed. He was home, but he was not home. And in that moment, something profound shifted between them. They were no longer just a man and a girl. They were two survivors, two halves of a whole, unspoken understanding. She had fled a home that had become a prison. He had returned from a war only to find that the world he'd fought for no longer had a place for him. And he no longer had a place in it. Both of them were exiles, stranded in the vast, unforgiving landscape of their own lives. They didn't need absolution. They didn't need the other to fix them, to mend the shattered pieces of their pasts. Their wounds were their own to carry. All they needed was for the other person not to leave. They needed the simple, profound anchor of another human presence in the darkness, a quiet witness to their survival. Just knowing that when the nightmares came, or when the howling of the wolves sounded too much like the screaming of the past, they would not be entirely alone. The fire died down. The red glow of the embers painted their faces in the deepening dark. They didn't need to say more. The most important things had been said in the spaces between their words. Grant finally stood up, the movement slow and stiff. He looked down at her for a moment, a long, unreadable expression on his face, before turning and walking back toward the dark doorway of the cabin. June remained by the dying fire for a few minutes more, watching the last of the embers fade to gray. Then she, too, stood and followed him inside, pulling the heavy door closed behind her, shutting them in with their shared ghosts and the new, fragile truth that had been spoken into the night. The false peace of the canyon was the first thing to break. It happened in the late afternoon, when the sun was a merciless white eye in the sky and the shadows of the saguaros stretched long and thin, like skeletal fingers reaching across the baked earth. Grant was on the porch, sharpening a small knife against a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape, 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 a familiar, meditative sound. He was watching the heat shimmer rise from the valley floor when he saw it. It was a smudge of dust against the distant blue of the horizon, Not the aimless, lazy plume of a prospector chasing a rumor, nor the slow drift of a cattleman moving his herd. This was a single, tight column of dust, moving with a speed and a directness that spoke of urgent purpose. It was heading straight for his cabin. An old, cold feeling settled in his gut. A feeling he hadn't known since the war. It was the certainty of approaching trouble. He set the knife and stone aside, his movements economical and deliberate. He didn't rise, he just sat and watched. His eyes narrowed against the glare. The dust cloud grew, resolving itself into the shape of a horse and rider. Inside the cabin, June was kneading dough for their evening meal. Her hands, no longer raw and trembling, worked the flour and water with a growing confidence. In the weeks since the night by the fire, a fragile contentment had settled over her. She was beginning to feel the shape of a future, a small, quiet thing she could hold in her hands, like the smooth, warm ball of dough. She heard the scraping of the whetstone stop. The sudden absence of the sound was more jarring than a shout. She moved to the open doorway. Wiping her floured hands on her apron, she saw what Grant was watching. A rider, still distant but closing the ground with a relentless, punishing pace. A knot of ice formed in her belly, instantly dissolving the warmth and peace of the afternoon. She knew, with a sick, soul-deep certainty, who it was. The world, which had grown to the manageable size of the cabin and the small clearing around it, suddenly shrank to a single, terrifying point of focus. Grant heard the small, sharp intake of her breath behind him. He didn't have to look at her to feel the terror radiating from her like a fever. He saw her back away from the doorway, her hands flying to her mouth. He saw her retreat into the shadows of the cabin, the way a rabbit freezes in the path of a hawk. Her past had found her. The rider was close now. He was a large man, mounted on a powerful black horse that ate the ground with long, powerful strides. He wore black from head to foot, a black hat, a black duster, black boots. It wasn't the practical, faded black of a working man. It was the stark, unforgiving black of judgment, a color meant to absorb the light and give nothing back. He reined his horse in a dozen yards from the porch, the animal snorting and stamping, its sides lathered with sweat. The man sat tall in the saddle, looking down at Grant with an air of absolute ownership. His face was weathered, but not in the way Grant's was. It was a hard, cruel weathering, a face that looked as if it had never known a moment of softness. His eyes were small and dark, like chips of obsidian. A long, braided leather whip was coiled and hung from his saddle horn. He ignored Grant completely. His gaze swept past him, probing the dark opening of the cabin door behind him. Then, his voice cut through the heavy silence, sharp and commanding. June. The name was not a question. It was a summons, an assertion of right, inside. Grant heard a small, muffled sob, a sound of a cage door slamming shut. Grant rose slowly from his chair. He didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the wall just inside the door. He didn't make any sudden moves. He simply stood up and walked the few paces to the doorway. Turning to face the rider, he filled the opening. His worn flannel shirt and denim trousers a stark contrast to the man's severe black. His body was a simple, physical statement, a barrier. The man on the horse finally deigned to look at him. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. It was a smile that didn't touch his cold eyes. "Get out of my way, old man," the man said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I've come for what's mine." Grant didn't move. His face was a stoic mask, but his eyes were alive, taking in every detail of the man, the horse, the whip. He didn't need to know the story. He had seen the preface written on June's wrists that first night. He had heard the terror in her voice when she whispered of the man her mother had chosen for survival. He knew a predator when he saw one. The war had taught him that much. "She's not going anywhere," Grant said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the still air with the weight of granite. The man's smile widened, a humorless display of teeth. He let out a short, derisive laugh. "Is that so? You think you have a say in this? You don't even know what she is." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous tone. "You know who she is to me." It was a test, a hook to draw him into an argument about rights and property, about a woman's place and a man's claim. Grant didn't bite. He had no interest in the man's laws or his twisted justifications. He was operating on a simpler, more fundamental code. He had opened his home, and this terrified girl had sought sanctuary within it. That was the only law that mattered in this canyon. He looked past the rider, his gaze fixing on the distant, unmoving line of the mesa. He thought of the war, of the countless men he had seen reduced to nothing more than a name on a list, their life and breath extinguished for a cause they barely understood. He thought of his own hollowed-out existence, a life lived in the shadow of death. And then he thought of June, of the life he had seen slowly, painstakingly returning to her eyes. He saw her kneading dough, her hands covered in the flour that would become their bread. He saw her sitting by the fire, her face illuminated by the simple, beautiful act of being. He brought his eyes back to the man on the horse. "I know she's alive," Grant said, and the words held a finality that no argument could breach. It was the only truth that mattered. He wasn't defending property or a principle. He was defending a life. For a heartbeat, the man in black just stared, his smile finally faltering, replaced by a look of pure, cold fury. He was a man accustomed to his authority being absolute, his will being law. This quiet, stubborn defiance from a man he considered nothing more than a dirt-scratching hermit was an insult he couldn't comprehend. Grant didn't wait for the man's reply. He didn't wait for the explosion of rage he knew was coming. He had said his piece. There was nothing more to say. With a slow, deliberate movement, he stepped back over the threshold and began to pull the heavy plank door shut. The man's face contorted in a snarl. With a motion too quick to follow, his hand shot to his saddle horn. Snatching up the whip, he spurred his horse forward, raising his arm. The door swung closed with a solid, definitive thud, plunging the cabin into dim, dusty light. Grant stood with his hand still on the latch, his back pressed against the wood. A split second later, the sound came. It was not a slap, but a violent crack, as loud and sharp as a rifle shot. The sound of braided leather moving faster than sound, striking the door with explosive force. The whole cabin seemed to shudder with the impact. A long, white splinter of wood appeared on the inside of the door, right at the level of Grant's head. "Outside!" The man screamed a string of curses, his voice thick with impotent rage. They heard the horse rearing and stamping, then the thunder of its hooves as he wheeled it around and galloped away, his fury-fueled retreat just as purposeful as his arrival. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute. June was pressed into the far corner, her knuckles white where she gripped her own arms. A single, silent tear traced a path through the flour dust on her cheek. Grant did not move. He remained with his back to the door, his eyes closed, feeling the vibration of the blow fade from the wood into his own bones. The unlocked door, his symbol of having nothing left to lose, had just become a shield, and in defending her, he had finally found something he was not willing to let go. The world had come knocking, and for the first time in a very long time. Grant Callahan had slammed the door in its face. The setting sun offered no comfort. It bled across the western sky in angry streaks of orange and purple, mirroring the bruised and unsettled feeling that had taken root inside the cabin. The departure of the man in black had not brought relief, only the grim certainty of a coming storm. He was not the kind of man to be denied. He would be back. Neither Grant nor June spoke of it. There were no words for the kind of dread that now filled the small space between them. It was a cold, heavy thing, palpable as the evening chill that began to creep through the chinks in the log walls. They ate their meal of cornbread and beans in silence, the simple act of chewing and swallowing feeling loud and obscene in the tense quiet. When they were done, Grant did something he had never done before. He rose and walked to the door, and with a grunt of effort, he lifted the heavy, thick wooden bar he had fashioned years ago but never used, and settled it into its iron brackets. The solid thud of the bar locking into place was a sound of finality. It was an admission of fear and a declaration of intent. The world was no longer welcome. Tonight, this small cabin was a fortress. June watched him, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Seeing that bar in place, a physical manifestation of the threat outside, made the fear real in a way the man's angry departure had not. This was real. This was happening. Grant turned from the door, his face an unreadable mask in the flickering lamplight. He picked up his rifle, the one he had been cleaning the night she arrived. He checked the action, his hands moving with an old, familiar economy. He placed the rifle on the table, next to a small, neat pile of cartridges. Then he took a three-legged stool and placed it in the darkest corner of the cabin, the spot with the clearest view of both the door and the single window. And there he sat down to wait. He did not look at June. He didn't have to. He was a sentinel, a soldier falling back on the only trade he truly knew, the grim business of waiting for a fight. June felt a tremor run through her. She wanted to run, to hide, to curl up and disappear. But the sight of Grant, his back straight, his quiet, resolute stillness filling the room, held her in place. He was not leaving. He was staying. For her. A wave of something fierce and unfamiliar washed through her, pushing back against the tide of her fear. It was a feeling of loyalty, a desperate need to not be a burden, to be worthy of the stand this silent, scarred man was making. She cleared their plates and then went to her blanket by the hearth. She did not lie down. She sat, her back pressed against the warm stones, and wrapped her arms around her knees. She would wait with him, two silent figures in the dim light, listening to the night, their shared breathing the only sound in a world that seemed to be holding its breath. The hours crawled by. The moon rose, a cold, silver disk that cast pale, ghostly light through the window. The fire in the hearth burned down to a bed of soft, glowing embers. Outside, the world was deceptively peaceful. A cricket chirped, an owl hooted from a distant rock spire. Every rustle of a leaf, every skittering sound of a night creature, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through June's veins. It was just after the moon had reached its zenith that they heard it. Not a shout, not a warning. It was the soft, stealthy crunch of a boot on the gravel outside. Then another, more than one. Grant's head came up. He didn't move from his stool, but his whole body went taut, like a coiled spring. His hand moved from his lap to rest on the stock of the rifle. June's breath caught in her throat. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears. There was no knock, no shouted demand. There was only a sudden, violent, splintering crash. The heavy wooden bar, which had seemed so solid, so final, buckled and then broke under the combined, synchronized impact of three heavy bodies. The door flew inward, slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. Three figures filled the opening, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. The man in black was in the center, a heavy, knotted club in his hand. On either side of him were two other men, rough, lean figures. One held a long, wicked-looking knife that gleamed in the dim light. The other was uncoiling a thick length of rope. The man in black stepped inside, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. "Should have let her walk out," he snarled. "Would have been easier on you." Before the words were even fully out of his mouth, Grant was moving. He didn't stand to fire the rifle. There wasn't time. From his seated position, he brought the rifle to his shoulder and fired. Not at the leader, but at the man with the knife to his left. The roar of the shot in the enclosed space was apocalyptic. The man with the knife grunted, staggering back a step, clutching a sudden dark stain spreading across his shoulder. But it was only a momentary advantage. The leader and the third man charged forward. Grant swung the heavy rifle like a club, catching the third man in the ribs. The man wheezed and stumbled, but the leader was already on him. He brought his club down in a vicious, overhead arc. Grant tried to block it with the rifle barrel, but the force of the blow was immense. The impact sent a jarring shock up his arms and knocked the rifle from his grasp. It skittered across the floor, useless. Grant was on his feet now, a soldier again, relying on instinct. He ducked under another swing and drove his fist into the leader's gut. It was like punching a side of beef. The man grunted but didn't go down. From the side, the third man recovered, lunged at him. Grant shoved him away, but the momentary distraction was all the leader needed. The club came again, not from above this time, but from the side, a short, brutal swing. Grant tried to turn, to absorb the blow on his shoulder, but he was too slow. The heavy, knotted wood connected with the side of his head, just above his temple. A starburst of white. Blinding pain exploded behind his eyes. The world tilted crazily, and the floor rushed up to meet him. He landed hard on his side, his head slamming against the packed earth. The sounds of the fight became muffled, distant, as a roaring wave of darkness began to pull him under. He could feel something warm and wet trickling down his face. Blood. Through the fog of pain, he saw them turn away from him, their task with him complete. He saw them move toward the corner, toward the hearth, toward June. A primal, desperate rage fought against the encroaching darkness. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs wouldn't obey. He was helpless. June screamed. It was a raw, ragged sound, torn from the deepest part of her. The man with the rope was advancing on her, his face a leering mask. The leader stood behind him, watching, savoring the moment. "Get her on her feet," the leader commanded. The man lunged, grabbing her arm. She fought back, kicking and scratching. A wildcat cornered, but she was no match for his strength. He hauled her to her feet, his fingers digging into her arms like talons. He began to drag her toward the door, toward the night, toward the fate she had run so hard from. She was screaming Grant's name now, a desperate, hopeless plea. She saw him on the floor, a dark pool spreading in the dirt beneath his head. He wasn't moving. A despair so profound it was like a physical blow struck her, stealing her breath, her will to fight. It was over. The leader laughed, a low, ugly sound. He turned his back on her, taking a step toward Grant's still form. "Make sure he's not getting up again," he said to the wounded man, who was now leaning against the doorframe, clutching his shoulder. And in that moment, as the leader's back was turned, something inside June snapped. The terror and despair didn't vanish, but they were consumed by a white-hot, incandescent rage. She was not property. She was not a thing to be taken. And this man, this monster, had hurt the only person who had shown her any kindness, the only person who had stood for her. Her eyes darted around, searching for a weapon. Her gaze fell on the small table next to the hearth. On it sat the oil lamp, its flame still burning with a low, steady yellow light. It wasn't a choice. It was pure, unthinking instinct. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she ripped her arm free from the grasp of the man holding her. He stumbled, surprised by her sudden ferocity. Before he could recover, she lunged for the table, her hand closing around the warm glass base of the lamp. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She just acted. She spun around. The lamp held high and brought it down with all of her strength on the back of the leader's turned head. There was a sickening, dull thud, followed by the sound of shattering glass. The man grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and staggered forward, his hands flying to his head. But it was the lamp's fuel that did the most damage. Burning oil splashed across his neck and the back of his duster, and in an instant, he was alight, screaming a new, high-pitched sound of agony and terror. Burning oil had also splashed onto the dry floorboards, onto the pile of kindling by the hearth, and onto June's own blanket. The flames caught immediately, greedily, licking up the dry wood of the walls. Smoke, thick and black and choking, began to fill the small cabin. The chaos was absolute. The wounded man and the man who had been holding June stared in horror at their burning leader, who was now stumbling blindly toward the door, beating at the flames on his back. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed. A roaring, hungry beast awakened in their midst. The fire, the screams, the sudden, violent turn of events, it was enough to pierce the fog of Grant's concussion. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his head screaming in protest. Through a haze of smoke and pain, he saw June, standing like a vengeful spirit in the heart of the spreading flames, her face illuminated by the fire she had started. He saw the two remaining men, their attention completely broken, their attack forgotten in the face of this new, terrifying threat. They abandoned the fight. They scrambled to help their leader, dragging him out into the night, their only thought to escape the inferno. Grant crawled toward June, who was now coughing, her eyes streaming from the smoke. He reached her, grabbing her hand. Her fingers closed around his, a desperate, tight grip. Together, they stumbled out of the burning cabin, collapsing onto the cool, clean dirt of the yard, gulping in the night air. They watched as the three men, one of them still smoldering and screaming, scrambled onto their horses and galloped away into the darkness, a frantic, disorganized retreat. The cabin was not destroyed. The fire, having consumed the dry kindling in a corner of the wall, began to die down as it reached the heavier, less flammable logs. A thick column of smoke poured from the open doorway into the night sky, but the immediate danger was past. They were alive, battered, bleeding, and now half homeless. But they were alive. Grant lay on his back, the world spinning, the pain in his head a roaring furnace. June knelt beside him, her hands shaking, her face smudged with soot. They had faced the darkness, and it had almost consumed them. But in the end, in the fire and the blood, they had held on to each other. And for now, that was enough. The world came back to Grant in pieces. The first was the sharp, acrid smell of smoke that stung his nostrils and throat. The second was the cool, gritty feel of the earth against his back. The third was a deep, thundering ache in his head that seemed to beat in time with his own heart. He groaned, a low, animal sound, and tried to push himself up. A hand, small but firm, pressed against his shoulder. "Be still," a voice said. June's voice. It was hoarse, laced with soot and shock, but it was there, a steady anchor in the spinning chaos of his senses. He let his head fall back. His vision swam, then slowly focused on the scene above him. The stars were brilliant, cold, and impossibly far away, scattered across a black velvet sky. A ragged column of smoke was still rising from the cabin, a dark wound against the moonlight. The fight replayed in his mind in a series of violent, disjointed flashes: the splintering door, the roar of the rifle, the blinding, white-hot pain. He felt her move beside him. The shaking had left her, replaced by a grim, focused energy. The terror was still in her eyes, but it was banked now, like embers glowing beneath a layer of ash. A new resolve had settled over her, born in the fire and violence. She had not been a victim tonight. She had been a survivor. She had been a fighter. "We have to go inside," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not safe out here." With her help, he managed to get to his feet. The world swayed violently, and he had to lean on her, his arm draped over her small shoulders. She staggered under his weight but did not buckle. She was a sapling of ironwood, slender but unbreakable. Together, they made their way back into the wounded cabin. The inside was a wreck. The door hung askew from one leather hinge. The floor was littered with shattered glass and the burned remnants of her blanket. A large, blackened scar ran up one wall and across a portion of the ceiling, the logs still radiating a faint, oppressive heat. But the fire was out, and the structure, for the most part, was sound. June guided him to the single chair by the table and eased him down. He slumped forward, his head in his hands, trying to will the roaring in his ears to stop. He was aware of her moving around the cabin, her steps soft but purposeful. He heard the splash of water as she filled a basin from the barrel, the rip of cloth. She came to him and knelt at his feet. She gently took his chin in her hand and tilted his head up. He didn't resist. He was too tired, too broken, to fight her care. She took a wet rag and began to clean the blood from the side of his face. Her touch was feather-light, a stark contrast to the brutality of the blow he had taken. He did not flinch. He did not make a sound. He simply watched her. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her lips were pressed into a thin, determined line. The lamplight, now placed on the far side of the table, cast a soft glow on her face, illuminating the streaks of soot on her cheeks and the fierce, protective light in her eyes. In that moment, she was the most beautiful, terrifying thing he had ever seen. He was seeing the woman who had survived a monster, who had run barefoot into a storm, who had picked up a lamp full of fire and used it to defend their small, broken world. She finished cleaning the gash on his temple. It was ugly, a deep, weeping cut, but the bleeding had slowed. Then her eyes moved down. His shirt was dark with a fresh stain, not from the head wound, but lower down, on his side. In the chaos of the fight, he hadn't even registered the blow, a vicious kick from the third man that had found its mark. She saw it, and her breath hitched. "There's more," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She reached for the buttons on his shirt. Her fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second. This was a new threshold, a boundary they had never approached. But the sight of the blood overrode any sense of impropriety. Her duty now was to the wound, not to modesty. With deft, determined movements, she unbuttoned his shirt, her knuckles brushing against the skin of his chest. Grant remained perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. He felt each button give way like a lock being opened, a wall coming down. He felt the cool night air on his skin as she pushed the rough fabric of the shirt off his shoulders. He didn't close his eyes. He kept them on her face, watching her. The shirt fell away, and the full, brutal history of his life was laid bare in the flickering lamplight. June stopped. The rag in her hand went still. Her eyes, wide and dark, traveled over the landscape of his torso. It was a roadmap of violence, a tapestry of old pain. The long, ropey scar from the Confederate bayonet was the most prominent, a pale, angry river that flowed from his neck, across his collarbone, and down his ribs. But there were others, so many others. A puckered, star-shaped scar on his shoulder where a musket ball had gone in, a series of smaller, jagged lines on his abdomen, the ghost of shrapnel, faded white lines from knife fights or bar brawls. His body was a testament to every war he had ever fought, both for his country and for himself. It was the body of a man who had survived being torn apart, again and again. She didn't gasp. She didn't recoil. A profound, aching sadness filled her eyes, an empathy so deep it was almost a physical thing. She saw not just the damaged skin, but the pain each mark represented. She saw the boy who had received them, the fear he must have felt, the loneliness of healing in a field hospital or a cold, empty camp. Slowly, as if in a trance, she reached out her hand. She did not touch the new wound, the fresh, bleeding bruise on his side. She touched the old ones, her fingertips, gentle and questioning, traced the path of the bayonet scar. The ridge of dead tissue was cold beneath her warm touch, a line of preserved history. She felt him shudder, a deep, involuntary tremor that ran through his entire body, but he did not pull away. Her hand moved to the bullet wound on his shoulder, her thumb circling the puckered flesh. She was reading him, learning the silent, violent language of his past. He had never spoken of Virginia, only to say he had never come back. He didn't have to. The story was written all over him. She looked up from the scars to his face. His eyes were locked on hers, and in their depths, she saw a vulnerability so raw and profound it made her own heart ache. She saw the soldier, the survivor, the lonely, broken man, all of him, laid bare before her. A whisper escaped her lips, so quiet it was barely more than a breath of air. "These," she said, her fingers still resting on the cold, hard ridge of his oldest wound. "They're mine now." It was not a claim of possession. It was a declaration of acceptance, a vow. She was taking on the weight of his history, sharing the burden he had carried alone for so long. She was saying that his pain was now her pain, that his past was now part of her present. You are not alone with this anymore. Something inside Grant Callahan, something that had been frozen solid for 10 long years, finally broke. He closed his eyes. He couldn't bear for her to see what was happening. He turned his head away, a gesture of pure, instinctual defense. But it was too late. A single, hot tear escaped from beneath his eyelid. It traced a path through the grime and dried blood on his cheek, a clean, glistening track in the dirt. Then another followed. He wasn't sobbing. He made no sound. It was a silent, agonizing release, the breaking of a dam that had held back a decade of grief and horror, and a loneliness so vast and crushing it had almost extinguished him. He was not crying from the pain in his head or the ache in his side. He was crying because, for the first time since he had walked off a battlefield as a hollowed-out ghost, someone had looked at all his broken pieces, at all the ugliness and all the pain, and had not turned away. Instead, she had reached out and said, "Mine." The dawn that followed the night of the fire was quiet and bruised. A hazy, smoke-tainted light filtered into the canyon, revealing the full extent of the damage. The cabin, their small bastion against the wilderness, looked like a wounded animal. The door hung drunkenly. The wall beside it was a gaping, blackened maw, and the air inside was thick with the ghost of a battle. They started the day not with words, but with work. It was the only thing that made sense, the only way to push back against the chaos that had tried to reclaim them. Grant, moving with a stiff, pained deliberation from the blow to his head, salvaged what he could. His tools, thankfully, had been on the far wall and were untouched. June, her face still smudged with soot, worked alongside him, her movements swift and efficient. She swept out the debris of shattered glass and burned wood, her small broom a weapon against the violation. She carried water. She sorted through scorched blankets. She did whatever needed doing without a single word of complaint. There was a new dynamic between them. They were no longer a man and a girl sharing a space, but partners in a desperate, necessary act of creation. They were rebuilding their home. The door was Grant's first task. He couldn't fix the broken one, so he set about making a new one. He chose a tall, straight pine from a small grove up the canyon. As he worked the saw, his movements were slower than usual, his face pale beneath its sun-weathered tan. Every so often, June would see him pause and press his fingers to his temple, his eyes closing for a moment against a wave of pain. She would bring him a cup of water without being asked, and he would drink it, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of the cup in a moment of silent, shared acknowledgement. He was a craftsman. She watched, fascinated, as he worked the raw wood. He taught her how to strip the bark with a drawing knife, showing her how to brace the log and pull the blade toward her in long, clean strokes. Her hands, soft and unused to such labor, quickly blistered, but she didn't stop. She wrapped them in strips of cloth and kept working, a grim determination set in her jaw. She was earning her place in this new world they were building, not with fear, but with sweat. As Grant shaped the planks, June tackled the wall. It was a messy, arduous job. She used his axe to chop away the charred, blackened wood, the acrid smell filling the air. She mixed mud and dried grass, just as she'd seen adobe bricks being made in a settlement she'd passed through long ago. She packed the mixture into the gaps between the logs, Her hands and arms soon caked in the thick, red clay. It was primitive, ugly work, but it was honest. With every handful of mud she pressed into the wall, she felt like she was sealing a wound, making their home whole again. They worked side by side for days, falling into a rhythm that was as natural as breathing. There was little talk, but there was constant communication. A shared glance, a hand offered to steady a plank. The simple act of passing a tool these became their language. He learned the limits of her strength and never asked for more. She learned the signs of his pain and knew when to insist he rest. The meals changed, too. The first night after the attack, huddled in the damaged cabin, she had made a thin stew from the last of their beans. She had given him the largest portion, pushing the bowl toward him with a silent insistence. Now, the small rituals of their meals took on a new, deeper significance. When Grant managed to trap a rabbit or shoot a grouse, he would carefully prepare it. And when he served their plates, he always made sure the largest, choicest piece of meat was on hers. He did it without ceremony, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She never said thank you. Words felt too small for the gesture. Instead, the next morning, there would be an extra piece of cornbread by his plate, baked a little browner, just the way she'd noticed he liked it. It was a quiet, continuous conversation of care, a barter of nourishment that fed more than just their bodies. The warmth in the cabin no longer came just from the hearth. It radiated from the small, shared table, from the simple, profound act of two lonely people looking after one another. They needed no vows, no promises for a future they couldn't possibly imagine. Their commitment was written in the rising of the sun. For Grant, the first conscious thought upon waking was no longer of the war or of the vast emptiness of his life. It was a quiet, immediate inventory, the soft sound of June's breathing from her cot across the room, the scent of wood smoke already in the air from the embers she'd banked the night before. She is here. That was the anchor. That was the promise. For June, the terror of waking was gone. She no longer jolted into consciousness with a gasp, her heart pounding with the fear of what the light might reveal. She now woke slowly, peacefully, to the familiar sight of Grant's broad back as he stood by the hearth, making coffee. He is here. That was her sanctuary. That was her peace. The certainty of the other's presence each morning was the only vow they needed. It was a promise renewed with every sunrise, solid and dependable as the ancient rock of the canyon itself. One afternoon, a week after the attack, the work was finally done. A new, sturdy door stood in place, complete with a new, thicker bar. The wall was patched, the ugly black scar covered over with smooth, red earth. The cabin was whole again, smaller and darker for the new wall, perhaps, but it was theirs. It was safe. They stood outside on the porch, watching the late afternoon sun paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and rose. A gentle breeze stirred the dust at their feet. They were both tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that was satisfying in its completeness. They had faced destruction, and they had rebuilt. June was leaning against a porch post, her gaze soft and distant. She looked at the work they had done, at the solid little cabin that had become her entire world. She thought of the nights spent listening to the wind, wondering if every sound was the return of the man in black. She thought of waking in the dark, her throat tight with fear, only to be calmed by the steady, quiet sound of Grant's breathing from the other side of the room. She turned her head and looked at him. He was staring out at the horizon, his profile stark against the fading light. The ugly bruise on his temple had faded to a sickly yellow-green, but the memory of the blow, of his body falling, of her own helplessness, was still sharp and clear in her mind. She spoke, her voice not much louder than the breeze, but clear and steady in the quiet air. "Don't let me wake up alone anymore." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a demand. It was a statement of fact, a plea, and a profound declaration of trust, all woven into a single, simple sentence. It was an admission that the space across the room was still too far, that the darkness still held terrors that only his presence could keep at bay. It was the bravest thing she had ever said. Grant turned his head from the horizon to look at her. His eyes, which so often held the bleak emptiness of the plains, were now filled with a deep, quiet intensity. He saw the truth of her request. He saw the fear she was still fighting, and the incredible strength it took for her to admit it. He saw a plea not just for protection, but for connection. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Words were clumsy, inadequate things for a moment like this. He simply held her gaze for a long, silent moment, a universe of understanding passing between them. Then he gave a single slow nod. It was a promise. It was an acceptance. It was an answer to a question she hadn't even known how to ask. It was the quiet, solemn click of the final piece of their new world falling into place. That night, she moved her cot from its place by the hearth and set it beside his. And in the quiet darkness of their mended home, two lonely people slept, finally, without fear. The days after the rebuilding were quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the full, warm silence of a pot simmering on a low fire, not the empty, cold silence of a vacant room. The coming of summer softened the hard edges of the canyon. The sun was warmer, the nights were gentler, and a scattering of stubborn, brilliant wildflowers began to appear in the cracks of the rocks, a testament to life's insistence. Inside the cabin, life had found its own quiet insistence. The two cots, now side by side, had become the anchor of their small world. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, not always needing a fire, and watch the bats dip and weave through the twilight air. They rarely spoke, but they were no longer separate in their silence. They were listening to the same night, breathing the same sage-scented air. A quiet understanding flowed between them, a current as steady and unseen as the creek that ran through the canyon. Grant had changed. The haunted, far-off look in his eyes had not vanished, but it was often replaced by a new, focused attention. He watched her. He watched the way the light caught in her hair when she bent over the hearth. He watched her hands, now strong and capable, as she ground corn or mended a seam. He had spent a decade turning his back on the world, and now he found his entire world contained in the small, quiet movements of the woman beside him. He saw the strength she had forged from her fear, the kindness she had protected from a cruel world, and a feeling he had long believed dead and buried, a feeling he mistrusted and feared, began to stir in the barren ground of his heart. June, too, had been reborn. The constant, gnawing fear that had been her companion for so long had receded, leaving in its place a profound sense of peace. She felt safe. It was a simple, elemental feeling, but for her, it was a miracle. She learned the landscape of Grant's moods as intimately as she was learning the canyon. She knew the tightness in his jaw meant the ghosts of the war were walking close. She knew the slight softening around his eyes meant a moment of peace. She saw the man beneath the scars, the quiet decency, the unyielding loyalty, and the deep, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. And she loved him for it. She loved him with a quiet, fierce tenderness that had no need for pretty words or grand declarations. It was a night in early summer, warm and still. The moon was a sliver of silver, and the sky was so thick with stars it looked as if a handful of diamonds had been tossed across black velvet. The air was heavy with the scent of night-blooming cactus and dry earth. They had retired to their cots, and the cabin was filled with the soft, rhythmic sound of their breathing. But June was not asleep. She lay on her side, watching the faint moonlight trace the lines of Grant's profile. She saw the harsh angle of his jaw, the straight line of his nose, the deep-set eyes shadowed by memory. She saw the man who had stood in a doorway for her, who had taken a blow for her, who had rebuilt a home with her. She felt the truth of her own heart, a truth so simple and powerful it left no room for doubt or fear. Slowly, quietly, she rose from her cot, The floorboards were cool beneath her bare feet. She moved across the small space that separated them, a gulf that now felt impossibly wide. She stood over him, a slender shadow in the moonlight. He was not asleep. His eyes were open, watching her, as if he had been waiting. He did not seem surprised. She did not speak. She did not cry. Words and tears were for a different kind of story, a different kind of pain. What she felt now was too deep, too certain for either. She simply reached down and took his hand. His hand was large, rough, and calloused from a lifetime of hard labor and harder fighting. It was a hand that knew the weight of an axe and the cold steel of a rifle. But as her smaller, softer hand closed around his, it was not rough. It was gentle. He curled his fingers around hers, a silent, questioning pressure. It was the first time they had touched with such deliberate, gentle intimacy. He looked up at her, and in the dim light, she saw the raw, desperate vulnerability that he kept hidden from the world. She saw a decade of pain, of shame, of a loneliness so profound it had nearly erased him. He had built walls of silence and solitude to protect the broken thing inside him. And now, with a single touch, she stood inside those walls. A sound escaped his throat, a ragged, broken whisper, a sound that was half prayer, half plea. "Take it off," he breathed, his voice raw with a pain that had nothing to do with any physical wound. He squeezed her hand, a desperate, pleading grip. "The fear, the shame, the past, just take it all off." He was not asking her to remove his clothes. He was asking her to remove the armor he had worn for 10,000 nights. He was asking her to look upon the ugliest, most broken parts of him and not turn away. He was giving her the key to the last locked room inside his soul. June understood. With her free hand, she reached for the top button of his nightshirt. Her fingers were steady. There was no hesitation. This was not a duty. Like tending a wound, this was a sacred right. She undid the first button, then the second, her movements slow and reverent. With each button, she felt as if she were peeling back a layer of his history, a layer of his pain. She pushed the fabric aside, exposing his chest to the cool night air and the pale moonlight. And there they were, the scars, a silent, brutal testimony. The moonlight seemed to pool in the pale, dead tissue, making the marks stand out in stark relief against his living skin. They were a constellation of violence, each one a star of extinguished hope. Her eyes followed the familiar, terrible path of the long bayonet wound, but her gaze came to rest on another, a deep, puckered divot just to the left of his sternum, directly over his heart. It was not a long scar, but it was deep, as if a plowshare had been violently driven into his chest, missing his heart by a fraction of an inch but tearing through the very soul of him. This was the wound from Virginia. This was the one that had never truly healed. She took a breath, and a profound, aching love filled her, a love that was fierce enough to face down any ghost. She leaned down, and with a touch as soft as a moth's wing, she gently placed the palm of her hand flat against his chest, her warmth covering the cold, dead scar. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her hand, a life that had refused to be extinguished. She looked into his eyes, and he held her gaze, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Mine now," she whispered, and the words were a vow, an absolution, a final, irrevocable claim. A shudder went through him, and a single tear, the one he had held back for a decade, finally broke free and traced a path down his temple into his hair. He reached up with his free hand and cupped the back of her head, his calloused fingers tangling gently in her hair. He drew her down to him. Their love was made in that sacred silence. It was not a thing of frantic passion, but of slow, deliberate discovery. It was a language of touch, a quiet conversation between two bodies that had known too much pain and were finally learning the grammar of tenderness. It was in the gentle press of his lips against hers, A kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow and a desperate, dawning hope. It was in the way her hands moved over his back, not with pity for his scars, but with a quiet reverence for the man who had survived them. It was in the way he held her, a touch that was not about possession, but about sanctuary, as if he were memorizing the feel of her, the first safe harbor he had known in a lifetime. In the quiet, mended cabin, under the distant, watchful eyes of the stars, two profoundly lonely people came together, and in the silent, holy darkness, they were not broken anymore. They were whole. The change in the cabin began with light, a few weeks after their world had almost ended in fire. Grant woke one morning with a new purpose. He didn't speak of it. He simply went to the wall opposite the door, the one that faced the rising sun, and began to work. He spent the better part of a week carefully cutting and removing two of the thick pine logs, fashioning a square opening where before there had been only solid, oppressive darkness. June watched him, a quiet question in her eyes. The cabin had been a fortress, a dark, safe place to hide from the world. A window was an invitation for the world to look in. But she trusted him. She saw the focused, almost reverent way he worked, his hands sure and steady. He was not just cutting a hole in a wall. He was performing a ceremony. When he was done, he fitted the opening with a heavy wooden shutter that could be barred at night. But during the day, he left it open. The first morning the sun streamed through that new opening. It changed everything. A bright, clean rectangle of golden light fell across the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was as if the cabin could finally breathe. Grant, the man who had spent a decade hiding his face in the shadows, had chosen to let the light in. June responded with her own act of faith. She began to spend her afternoons walking the canyon floor, her apron gathered into a makeshift basket. She would return with her apron full of the roots and seeds of the wild desert flowers, the tough, vibrant blooms that somehow managed to thrive in the harsh, unforgiving soil. She cleared a small patch of earth along the front of the cabin, just beneath the new window. She turned the soil with a sharpened stick, her hands working the hard, red dirt until it was soft and yielding. There, she planted her garden. It was an act of audacious hope. She was planting beauty in a place that had only known survival. Grant would watch her from the porch, a small, unreadable smile playing on his lips. He was a man of rock and wood and iron. She was a woman of earth and water and light. Together, they were making a home. They never spoke the words, love, commitment. Forever these were words for a different kind of people, a different kind of world. Their language was one of action, a constant, quiet dialogue of care. There was no one to see it, for the most part. The canyon remained their private kingdom. But one day, an old prospector, his pack mule laden with tools and disappointment, passed by on his way to the next rumored strike. He stopped for a drink of water from their creek. He saw Grant mending a piece of harness on the porch, his hands strong and sure. He saw June emerge from the cabin, carrying a tin cup of cool water for him, another for Grant. He saw the way she handed the cup to Grant without a word, and the way Grant's fingers brushed hers as he took it. He saw the easy, comfortable silence between them, the way they moved around each other as if they were two parts of a single organism. The old prospector, a man who had been alone for 30 years, saw it all. He nodded his thanks, drank his water, and continued on his way. He didn't need to be told. Anyone with eyes could see it. Those two people belonged to each other as surely as the canyon belonged to the sky. Their lives were a tapestry woven from these small, unspoken acts of devotion. When the wind turned cold and began to howl down from the high peaks, a sign of an early autumn storm, June didn't have to say a word. Grant would already be outside, securing the latch on Jericho's corral, and hanging a heavy, treated canvas over the new window to block the draft. He would check the patch on the wall, running his hand over the dried mud to ensure it was holding firm. and Grant would return to the cabin to find that she, in turn, had anticipated his needs. A larger stack of firewood than usual would be neatly piled by the hearth. A thick stew would be simmering over the fire, filling the cabin with the warm, savory scent of rabbit and wild herbs. She would have his thick wool coat, the one he rarely wore, draped over the back of his chair, ready for him. It was a silent, perfect partnership, a continuous dance of anticipating and providing, of seeing a need and meeting it before it could ever be spoken. One evening, Grant brought back a small, leather-bound ledger from a trip to the nearest settlement, a full day's ride away. He had traded a few good pelts for flour, salt, and coffee. The ledger was an extravagance. He also brought a small bottle of ink and a single, sharpened pen nib. He placed them on the table in front of June without a word. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a quiet, wondering joy. In the long, peaceful evenings, he had been teaching her. He had started by tracing letters in the dust on the floor with a stick, the way his own father had taught him. He taught her the shape of an A, the curve of a B. Her progress was slow, her fingers clumsy at first, but she had a fierce, hungry intelligence. She learned quickly. The ledger was a gift, a validation. It was his way of saying, "Your thoughts are worth recording. Your story is worth writing." She spent that evening just touching the book, running her fingers over the smooth, clean pages. The next day, while Grant was out checking his snares, she sat at the table, opened the book to the first page, dipped the pen in the ink, and prepared to write. She thought of all the things she could put down. She could write about the storm that brought her here, or the fire that nearly took them away. She could write about the wildflowers, or the stars, or the quiet strength in Grant's hands. But when she finally lowered the pen to the page, only one word came. It was the first word she had ever written, and it was the truest word she knew. In a slightly shaky but clear, determined hand, she wrote, "Home." When Grant returned that evening, he saw the open ledger on the table. He walked over, his heavy boots silent on the floorboards. He looked down and saw the single, perfect word. He stood there for a long time, just looking at it, that one word, written in her hand, on the first page of a new book. In the center of the cabin they had rebuilt together. It was a foundation stone. It was an anchor. It was everything. He looked over at June, who was watching him from her seat by the hearth, a shy, hopeful look on her face. He saw her, really saw her, and in that moment, the last of the old walls inside him crumbled to dust. For 10 years, he had believed himself a ghost, a hollowed-out man, unworthy of peace, of comfort, of love. He had accepted his loneliness as a just penance for the things he had seen and done. But this woman, this slip of a girl who had survived her own hell, had looked upon all his scars, all his brokenness, and had not seen a monster. She had seen a man. She had claimed his wounds as her own. She had built a home with him from the ashes of their pasts. Her love, quiet and steadfast as the sunrise, had been a constant, gentle pressure against the locked door of his heart. And now, finally, it had swung open. A feeling so profound and overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees, washed over him. It was a feeling of gratitude, of peace, of a joy so pure and sharp it was almost painful. In the wild heart of the Arizona Territory, surrounded by a harsh and unforgiving land, Grant Callahan understood, for the very first time in his life, that he was worthy of being loved. He was home. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. We'd love to connect and share our thoughts with you. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and consider giving it a boost by hitting the hype button, so this story can be heard by more people.